Hello and welcome to Seasons Cast, a Canadian Highlander podcast. We may not be Canadian, but we do hopefully live near enough to Scotland for that to count towards something. I'm your host Tom, better known by friends, allies and enemies as Wilko, and with me is my co-host Aaron, better known by friends, allies and enemies as Aaron.
Hello!
Today in episode 4, given the current state of the world, we thought that we'd take sort of relaxed, sit back and talk about some cards that we personally enjoy in Canadian Highlander. So there's going to be no card spotlight to start us off, considering this is, in a sense, a giant card spotlight bonanza. So we both picked 5 cards that we think are actively good in the format and that we enjoy playing. Non-pointed cards and cards that aren't obvious auto includes necessarily, so like we won't be talking about cards like Thoughtseize, for example, because if you're playing a black deck, there is a very, very high chance you play Thoughtseize. However, to start off with, we have a couple of cards that, in Aaron's case, it's definitely a format staple, but we'd be remiss if we didn't let him talk about it. And in my case, a very not so playable card, but a card that to me just screams Highlander. So Aaron, what card do you have as your honourable mention today?
So for my honourable mention, I'm going to very politely, completely and utterly disregard everything you just said about not talking about format staples. Because if you have played a game of Magic the Gathering with me at any point during my Magic career, there is always one card that I adore playing.
Is it Delver of Secrets?
It's not Delver of Secrets, as much as I love that card. First of all, the card I'm going to be talking about is red.
Is it Monastery Swiftspear?
No. Again, really good creature, but not quite what I'm going to be talking about today. It's
Young Pyromancer.
Oh, if you had let me finish, I would have explained that it's a spell. It's an instant. It's a red instant. It's killed you plenty of times before.
Is it Price of Progress?
It's Lightning Bolt, okay? It's Lightning Bolt. So Lightning Bolt is a instant for red that says, deal 3 damage to any target. It's one of my favourite clean designs in all of Magic. It's exactly whatever you need it to be at that exact moment. It can be a kill spell. It can be a burn spell. It can be a combat trick. It's just such a versatile thing for such a cheap cost. Paying 1 mana for 3 points worth of damage is an exceptional trade-off. At instant speed as well, it's just... I adore this card so much. It slots into like a variety of different decks. It slots into your aggressive decks. It slots into your mid-range decks. It slots into your control decks. It's just, if you're playing red, it's just, I'm struggling to see a single reason why you would ever not put Lightning Bolt in there. And again, I know we're not going to be talking about stables, but to pass up an opportunity to not gush about my favourite card in all of Magic, I just couldn't do it.
Yeah, it's not really a card that needs any sort of deep discussion. Like you say, if you are playing red, you play it. Even Storm plays it. You know, Storm plays it to remove pesky cards like Thalia. 1 mana, deal 3 damage to face. As you say, great rate, very clean design. Deals with pesky creatures, planeswalkers, pesky opponents that happen to be on 3 or less life. Like you say, there's not really any deep, meaningful conversation that can be said about Bolt. Everything that can be said about Bolt has been said already. Everything that can be seen to be done with Bolt has been done already. It's one of the original best cards in Magic, and to this day, it still stands out as an amazing card. Yeah. On the less efficient, powerful, clean, and all those words side of Magic, let's talk about my honorable mention. When working out my list, I was thinking like, even if the cards on this list, a lot of them see play in Commander, some of them see play in Modern and Legacy and, other formats and stuff. But I wanted to think of cards where it's like, when I look at this card, what is one of, if not the first format that comes to mind? This card is definitely by no means a staple, is arguably bad, but maybe the most Canadian Highlander card there is. I am, of course, talking about a card recently added to the historic format on MTG Arena. I am, of course, talking about Hidetsugu Second Right. For those wondering why Aaron's laughing, this was the one card I didn't tell him I was talking about, because I wanted his genuine reaction, and I think that says it all, really. Hidetsugu Second Right is 3 and a red for an instant that says, if target player has exactly 10 life, Hidetsugu Second Right deals 10 damage to that player. When introduced to Canadian Highlander as a format, this was a card that just immediately stuck out in a lot of lists I was looking at. I'm like, what is this? What is this card? And then I learned about, like, oh, well, you play it in mid-range decks and you play it with cards like Grove of the Burn Willows, so you can slowly but surely put your opponent's life total up before dealing damage to them. And as I say, it's an incredibly niche, incredibly specific card. But it's a card that just, you are never going to see this in Modern or Legacy. You're not going to see this in Commander because it deals 10 damage to exactly one player, and that player has to be on a specific life total. It's such a bad card, but oh Lord, do I love it. And when trying to think of an honorable mention, I had a few cards that I was thinking about, but the second I saw Hidetsugu Second Right on a Scryfall search or a tapped out look at deck lists, I can't quite remember what it was. It was just like, there's no other card I can talk about. This card is hilarious and amazing. And with April Fool's Day just gone, why not talk about the look on anyone's face when this card sees play, gets played against them, or better yet, kills them, is just absolutely wonderful. When I think of Canlander cards, again, like outside of staples and stuff like that, when I think of cards that are quintessentially Canlander, could only really be played in Canlander, Hidetsugu Second Right is one of the cards I think about. Aaron, do you have anything to say about this powerhouse?
I have absolutely 0 words. I think you basically said everything, but I was going to say, I was going to mention the fact that you very kindly given me a foil copy of it. I was racking my brain for a while to try and figure out what card you were going to talk about, but you had to hide from me. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that if I had put a large bet on the cards I thought it was going to be, I would have lost considerable money, because nowhere on God's green earth was I thinking you were going to talk about it again to Second Right. And I know I'm butchering that pronunciation, and I'm not going to try again because I will get it wrong.
I think it's Hidetsugu, but
I'm just going to call it Second Right for safety reasons. But it's so obvious now that you've said it, but it's like it showed up in lists that we were talking about for ages, and we kept discussing it and saying, wouldn't it be great if we did this? And I just, what a card.
It's a card that sat in our sort of like Canlander. There are going to be heavy air quotes here, playables boxes for a while, and we've never quite managed to. It's always been like the 101st card where it's like, we really want to stick it in, but there is this card that's a straight up better. But yeah, like I say, I don't think for you or me there is a more quintessentially Highlander card. And so even though I can't recommend playing this card, I just had to talk about it, just like you had to talk about Lightning Bolt. You love Lightning Bolt because of how powerful, clean, and iconic it is in Magic. And I love Hidetsugu Second Right because Canadian Highlander is a format like no other, and the ability to play cards like Hidetsugu Second Right in the format is one of the reasons why. And although you didn't have many words to say about Hidetsugu Second Right, I'm assuming you have 5 cards that you have many more words to talk about. So why don't you give us our first offering of your top 5 non-staple, non-pointed cards, what I like in the format? We may have to shorten this title.
So the card I'm going to talk about first is a relatively newly printed card. It's a white instant for a card called Ephemerate that reads, exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. It also has Rebound, which is if you cast it from this spell from your hand, you exile it as it resolves. At the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast this card from exile without paying its mana cost. I'm a big fan of blink effects and high value enter the battlefield triggers. When I get a card that allows me to not only double up, but then get another cast for free in a card like Ephemerate, like automatically I'm in love with this style of card. You can have like low impact cards where you can blink things like Wood Elves to get another land or reset a Kitchen Finks. But it kind of scales up a little bit and can go into things like blinking Recruiter of the Guard or Imperial Recruiter, where you can use it as another tutor effect. One of my absolute favorite ways that Ephemerate works is the loop that you can do with Eternal Witness and Spellseeker. And we talked about this a little bit at length in episode 1, so if you're unfamiliar with that combo in particular, go back and take another listen. We explain it in a lot more detail there. But as a very, very quick overview, with Spellseeker out, you cast Ephemerate, target Spellseeker, blinks, go get a tutor into your hand, use the tutor to go get Eternal Witness. Eternal Witness gets back the Ephemerate once it's finished rebounding. The Spellseeker goes and gets Time Walk. You cast Time Walk, recast Ephemerate, blink Eternal Witness, take infinite turns. It's fantastic. And while blinking your high-value enter the battlefield creatures is incredibly great, one of the other plus sides to Ephemerate as well is the fact that it is a good protection spell for when one of your key threats is being targeted by a piece of removal, for example. Being able to blink it and re-enter it to fizzle out any form of removal spells that are being targeted at it, and then having the rebound aspect to target one of those higher value ETBs, or again, just blinking another creature with an enter the battlefield effect to get the maximum amount of value out of it.
Yeah, it's not a card that I'd call niche, but it does go in some sort of fairly specific decks. But in those decks, it is incredibly flexible and incredibly powerful and allows you to do lots of different things. Decks with a lot of ETBs that, can get you lands, blow up artifact and enchantments, or in like Spellseeker, Eternal Witness's case, often win the game if paired together. It's just a fantastically powerful card that, allows you to reuse a lot of those really neat effects. Or, as you say, blank removal, if not both together. Blanking, say, a Path to Exile on a Kitchen Finks feels really, really good. But it is the ability to reuse your tutor effects like Spellseeker, like Recruiter of the Guard, that is probably the best thing it can be doing, which is a nice segue into my first card, which is a card that is very, very good at stopping tutor effects. In our local meta, there is a terror that people seem to have when playing against me when I have 2 mana up in my Sultai deck. Whether it's people on Paradox Academy, or even people just in the control mirror, just as they pick up their fetch and they look at me and they put it down and they think and they ponder, because they are playing around Shadow of Doubt. Shadow of Doubt is blue/black, blue/black, so 2 hybrid Dimir mana, for an instant that says players can't search their libraries this turn, draw a card. And although this card is symmetrical, it also really, really isn't. Because, of course, you are very aware when this card is coming and your opponent is not. I have countered small-scale things from late-game fetch lands where I was like, I'll get a bit of value out of this and draw a card. I've countered nothing at all and just essentially cycled it to draw a card. But then other times I've hit a Paradox Academy player who's just spent a bunch of mana and a land to use, help me out here, the Inventor's Fair, searching for the game-winning artifact, or against my blue-white opponent, used it when they've gone to Mystical Tutor for an Entreat the Angels or a Wrath effect to deal with my board. It's a extremely simple card, but a card that in the right situations can just be game-winning, and at absolute worst, essentially has Cycling 2 on it. Obviously, it's counterable Cycling 2, but if they counter my Shadow of Doubt, I am very okay with that. Whether it's, like I say, hitting small-scale things or big-scale things, I've hit Scapeshift players with it before and stuff like that. But at the same time, I've literally just cycled it to draw a card. It is a card that has never felt bad for me. Puts the fear in the opponent in games when they know that you're playing the card. It's the sort of day situation in Legacy. It's like, as soon as they see Days and Legacy, they'll be playing around Days for quite a while. And as soon as people realize I'm playing Shadow of Doubt, that's where the fear comes in, where they pick up their fetch land and then they put it back, and then they look at me and then they look down. And it's a card that has sort of applications even when you don't have it. And a card like that just fills me with so much joy. And you also get to play with one of my personal favorite arts in the entirety of Magic the Gathering. Greg Staples did an amazing job, and I am so lucky to have a signed foil copy by him. One of my absolute favorite cards of all time. And again, a card that I couldn't not talk about. Aaron, any love for Shadow of Doubt on your end?
I mean, if you want me to say nice things about the times you've cast Shadow of Doubt when I crack my fetch, I mean, I'm afraid you are going to be waiting a considerable length of time. But I think you hit the nail on the head. It's the Days. It's that fear of, have they got it? Like, can they do this? Can I do my game plan? Can I crack my fetch? And sometimes, yeah, it sucks because you've basically stripped mined me and drawn a card, and other times I've completely lost the game because I've sacked my Inventor's Fair but was going to go get me my Paradox Engine, and I've just paid 5 mana for me to strip mine myself, basically. Yeah, it's great. It's versatile. Like with Demir, mana makes it a little bit easier to cast in control shells where it's too intensive. And like I said, the worst case scenario is it just draws a card. It's never a dead card. It's fantastic.
Restricting your opponent's tutor effects is an effect that can just not be understated. If only there was another card that did a similar thing permanently while it was in play. Aaron, do you know any such card?
I might just know the one. My next card is called Aven Mind Sensor. It's 2 and a white for a flash flying 2/1 bird wizard. It says, if an opponent would search a library, that player searches the top 4 cards of that library instead. I have been gotten by this card on so many occasions and have gotten people with this card on so many occasions. It is wonderful. We mentioned in previous episodes, especially in our points list episode, how prevalent and how strong tutor effects are in this format. And when you're reducing your opponent from searching from 100 cards to 4, it's just wonderful. Unlike Shadow of Doubt, which is an exceptional card, this, while it remains on the battlefield, continues to do it. And it's not even symmetrical. It's only if an opponent would search a library. So your fetches, your tutors, all perfectly fine. And an absolute worst case scenario, it's a 3-mana 2/1 flash flyer. Like, card's great.
If you are playing a white creature deck, there is a very high chance that you are playing Aven Mind Sensor because, yeah, as you say, at absolute worst, it's a 3-mana 2/1 flyer, which isn't the best, but it can just restrict your opponent's options so much. Like I say, like, if they draw a fetch land, they're like, oh, I don't really want to crack this. If they draw a tutor, it's like, oh, it's not the best. It can sometimes not work the best, like say against fetches, for example. If they crack, say, a Prismatic Vista in a mono blue deck, there's probably a fairly high chance there's an island in their top 4. But against decks that are wanting to tutor a lot or look for specific cards, so combo decks or control decks with mystical tutor, it could just be game ending. Against your bad deck that we mentioned earlier, Spellseeker, for example, is often looking for specific cards like Ephemerate or Time Walk, and if they're not in the top 4, that's a shame. It's a card that doesn't have to have a big impact to do a lot, being as pesky as threatening planeswalkers, making your opponent's fetch lands awkward. That's all it needs to do. It is a card that, if you're playing a white creature deck, is very likely in there already. So it's close to being a staple, but it's not necessarily the first card that people think of for like white mid-range decks. You know, they'll often think of cards like Brimaz, or if they're in blue-white, they might think of Geist. If they're in white-green, they might think of Loxodon Smiter or stuff like that. But it's a card that, even though its body isn't the best, as I say, the fact that it's a creature that can get in chips of damage, that can make some of your opponent's top decks awkward, it doesn't have to do a lot to do a lot. Unlike Shadow of Doubt, it can obviously be removed. in response to the effect. There's been plenty of times where I've sort of tested the waters with a fetch land with, say, a Fatal Push in hand or something like that, see if the Stifle Bird's there, before I cast a card like Mystical Tutor, Demonic Tutor, something like that. But if your opponent doesn't have the removal, it's a card that is pesky enough and annoying enough to do some serious work. Pretty much every deck in the format, Aven Mind Center is going to have some impact on. Every deck wants to tutor to some degrees, whether it's small things like fetch lands or larger, more splashy effects like my next card that I would like to talk about, which is Primeval Titan. And it is 4 green for a 6/6 Trampler Giant. Whenever Primeval Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, you may search your library for up to 2 land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Modern players will be very familiar with this card. Legacy players may be somewhat familiar with this card. And oh boy, you bet Commander players are familiar with this card as they stare at it wishing they could put it in their green decks. Primeval Titan's just one of my all-time favourite Magic cards. It's such a ridiculous card. In Canadian Highlander, often bringing along its 2 friends, Thespian Stage and Dark Depths, so that you can bring out Marit Lage. Similar to Lightning Bolt, I don't think there's so much that can be said about it, but I think people already know what to do with it. It's a card that can be played as a ramp engine, as a combo piece with the Depths combo that I mentioned. It's just never a bad card in a deck that wants lots of mana. In a deck like Hoof, it's an absolute standout card, giving you an alternate win con in the fact that it's a 6/6 Trampler on its own. It can ramp you, get lands like Gaia's Cradle, or give you an alternate win con in the Depths combo. It allows for a lot of versatility, but pretty much all that versatility involves bashing your opponent over the head with the value it generates. Aaron, anything you have to say about our boy Primetime?
God, I love Primeval Titan. Card's absolutely outstanding. I remember the first time that I saw that card, I was like, okay, it's a 6 mana 6/6 and then it's a battlefield, it searches for 2 lands. Cool, fine, whatever. And then I read it again. Like you said, like we mentioned the Dark Depths combo quite a bit, but it's any land in my Elf Ball deck. I can go get Gaia's Cradle and Keswick Wolf Run. I can go and get just a plethora of any different lands that I need. And even then, if they don't remove it straight away, it's a 6 mana 6/6 Trampler. It's great.
Yeah, I've gotten all sorts of lands with Primetime in all sorts of decks. I've got Maze of Ith in sort of land-based decks and control decks. I used to play it in Sultai Control back in the day before I realised it's not really the effect I want. It was getting man lands to threaten my opponent. In Hoof, it can get, again, like Raging Ravine, the red-green man land. It can get mana, it can get Wolf Run, so every creature I top deck is a threat. As I say, we will end up repeating ourselves the more we talk about this card, because there are definitely specific lands that everyone has in mind when they think of Primetime. Because of Canlander, it being the sort of a third part of the Depth stage combo a lot of the time, that's why we constantly bring it up. But to other people, Keswick Wolf Run might be that land that always comes up. Inkmoth Nexus might be that land that always comes up. There will be some lands in your head that you are thinking of right now where it's like, oh, yes, because of Primetime, I get to get this land or this land. And it just gives you so many powerful options on a also extremely powerful threat and card that is a pretty much must answer whenever it hits the table.
Yeah, getting any land you want to is a really nice, powerful effect, which also very nicely leads us on to my third card that I want to talk about in this episode. It is Knight of the Reliquary. Knight of the Reliquary is a 1 green white creature human knight. It is a 2/2. It says, Knight of the Reliquary gets +1/+1 for each land card in your graveyard. Already quite strong. However, you can tap Knight of the Reliquary, sacrifice either a forest or a plains, and you get to search your library for a land card and put it into play, then shuffle your library. While not like as immediately impactful as something like a Primeval Titan slamming down, Knight of the Reliquary is just kind of that mid-range threat that you really want in those colours. It's exponential growth, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and more value the longer it remains in play. You can do cheap shenanigans like sacrificing a forest to go get a fetch land, then immediately sacrifice that fetch land to increase the size of your knight even further. You can go and use this to go and get particular lands that you need at that moment in time, like the aforementioned Maze of Ith, to deal with any large-scale creatures that are attacking. It's just such a powerful thing. And one of the key differences I want to mention between Primeval Titan and Knight of a Reliquary is the fact that the land that you tutor for comes into play untapped. It's a repeatable, tutorable effect on a large-scale body for 3 mana. It's just such a great card.
Yeah, Knight of the Reliquary is essentially Primeval Titan's little brother, but that doesn't mean that it's in any way worse than Prime Time. In fact, a lot of the time in, for instance, mid-range decks, it's almost certainly better to play Knight of the Reliquary. It comes down, it's half the mana of Primeval Titan. And Primeval Titan is, although a bigger, splashier effect, can often lead to a lot of samey gameplay. You've already probably guessed by the number of times I've mentioned it, but going Prime Time into Dark Depths Thespian stage is a very common occurrence in this format, and although I love the card Prime Time, it's a sort of combo that I get bored of very quickly. Knight of the Reliquary, because of its restrictions, doesn't really have that, but it also allows it to be a lot more flexible. Primeval Titan is not really known for staying on defense, because you can't use it. He has to ETB or attack. Whereas Knight of the Reliquary, you can hold him back on defense, and then at the end of your opponent's turn, you can go and get a land, whether that be a land to make him bigger, or a land whose ability you want to use, like Gavany Township, or Gaia's Cradle for mana next turn, or Maze of Ith. It's really up to you, and the versatility is something that I think lends it to being a more useful card more of the time, if not necessarily a more powerful card. Both cards are fantastic, sometimes seen together, sometimes seen apart, and they are both cards that are near and dear to both of our hearts. Now, if you've listened to episode 1, I brought a land up in that episode, but you've probably been yelling at the screen for a while now, Wilko, why haven't you mentioned this land already? Well, that is because it is my number 3 card. My number 3 card is a legendary land called Caracas. It has tap, add white to your mana pool, or tap, return target legendary creature to its owner's hand. This is the card that I referred to earlier, where it's basically a staple. If you are playing a white deck, there is a very, very low chance that you are not playing Caracas, because the card is insanely good. But I felt that it needed talking about because it's banned in Commander, similar to Prime Time, and a lot of people seem to look at Caracas and then stop as soon as they think, oh, well, it can bounce your opponent's commander, so that's fine. That's not all it does, though. It's one of those lands that I was referring to earlier, where it's the versatility that it gives you. Yes, it allows you to bounce pesky legendary creatures on your opponent's side, like the Brimazes, the Jace the Mind Sculptors, or even the Marit Lieges of the world. It also allows you to reuse or protect your own legendary creatures. You can reuse a Titania's ETB, something I quite often do in land-based decks. You can attack with a Geist of Saint Traft and then bounce it after it's made the angel if it's blocked by something that would otherwise kill it. In Death and Taxes, it's fantastic for bouncing Thalia when against control or combo decks, and they finally found a way to deal with it so they can get it off the board. It's a card with a lot of different applications in a lot of decks, but it's a card that I think a lot of people may just think, oh, I can bounce my opponent's creature and that'll be it. I've essentially click-locked people with it by playing Vendilion Click, looking at their hand every turn and seeing what they've drawn. You can do it with Venser Shaper Savant to constantly bounce permanents. You can even do stuff like bounce a Venser Lord High Artificer to keep making tokens. There's lots of application for this card, and obviously it depends on what legendary creatures you play. It's a card that I get to do tricksy things with, and interactions keep coming up with it that you hadn't thought of before. And it's a card that I deeply, deeply love. My personal favorite, I just want to get a quick story in here. This was in a Legacy event rather than a Canadian Highlander event, but still a thing that, when I did, my opponent's eyes just widened. I had an Umazawa's Jitte in play, and my opponent had used Oko Thief of Crown to turn it into an elk. And although it stops being an artifact, it stays being legendary. And so to reset my Umazawa's Jitte, I played Caracas and returned it to my hand because it was now a legendary elk. And that just filled me with so much giddy joy when I realized that interaction was available to me. And it's something my opponent just hadn't even thought of. And it's the stuff like that that is why I wanted to talk about Caracas. It's a land that a lot of people, when playing white decks, will just throw in because it's Caracas, it's good, right? You bounce your opponent's, cards that we mentioned earlier, your opponent's Merit Ledge or whatnot. But it has so much utility beyond that. And I think it's a good idea when building a deck to look at the legendary creatures in it and see if there's any sort of niche interactions that you think could come up quite regularly. For instance, in Legacy, as soon as they changed the Planeswalker rule, I was really excited because it meant that I can now Caracas my Gideon ally of Zendikar of my opponent's Swords to Plowshares. So I can actually protect it now with Caracas, which I couldn't do before because Planeswalkers weren't legendary. Similarly, I can attack with a Gideon, bounce it, play it, and then make a 2/2 if I've got the mana and stuff like that. There's all these little niche things that can come up but can mean the difference between losing and winning a game.
Yeah, I don't really feel like I have anything to add for when it comes to talking about Caracas. I think it'd be a little bit remiss of me to try and explain things that you might have missed about Caracas when you are our resident D&T expert in our local game store. You've taught me so much about Caracas and kind of the interactions it can have for dealing with your own stuff and your opponent's stuff. And it's just such a kind of like heavy threat where it's always there and it's going to like blank a removal spell or do something that's going to like set you back a turn and just always feels really irritating. So it's always one of my kind of like top targets to remove when I see it. Like with either like kind of a wasteland, a field of ruin, or anything like that. Which also kind of nicely ties me into my fourth card that I want to talk about, which is Run-a-Map Excavator, which is 2 and a green for a 2/3 Naga Cleric that says, you may play land cards from your graveyard. I think one of the like key points for why I love Run-a-Map Excavator is the fact that it almost makes you never miss a land drop. Being able to like kind of play fetch lands from your graveyard to constantly make sure that you've hit your land drop every single turn for that kind of smooth consistency, no matter what deck you're playing, is great. It allows you to replay key lands that have been destroyed by a strip mine, wasteland, Armageddon, or any form of land destruction effect, as the aforementioned Caracas, or if your Merit Ledge got bounced, then you can replay your Dark Depths and try the combo again. But it's so much more than that. It allows to start having kind of a layer of complexity with all of your turns and how you want to start doing things. For example, if you want to uptick your Liliana of the Veil and discard a land, but it's the only land in your hand, you're still not going to miss that land up. You've still got the value from it while your opponent's forced to discard. If you want to cycle a land, for example, to try and draw another card, you can then play that cycled land from your graveyard into play. It ties in really nicely into land-based combos for things like Fastbond to play all the lands out of your deck by replaying fetch lands over and over again and constantly getting more lands into play. It's just such like a versatile creature, and like, worst case scenario, it's Crucible legs on a stick or without legs, however we want to refer to it as technically a snake. Worst case scenario, it's a beta, but we're not looking for that. It's not the greatest stats, but it's just such a nice effect.
Yeah, we both play a lot of green creature-based decks, especially Hoof. You and me both love Hoof. And there have been plenty of times we've played like a Dork on turn 1 and then a Ramanap on turn 2, and then like we don't have a land drop or anything like that. We may not even have a fetch land at all, so like its ability is useless. But at the end of the day, as you say, it's still a 2/3. It's still going to threaten our opponent, threaten Planeswalkers. It blocks well because it's got a 3 toughness, which is decent enough. Yeah, as you say, it's just a solid card. I think we've talked enough about lands and land synergies, and oh my god, it gets this land. But as you say, it's a good mid-range card. It's a good combo piece in the right lands-based decks and stuff like that. It's a good value engine. It's good. Put it in your decks if it isn't already, and you have decent land synergies or so like that. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it if it's like literally just fetch lands in your deck. It might not be the worst, but the ability to get back the Horizon land cycle that draws cards, or like I say, if you have lands in your deck where it's like, this land is really good and quite important for my deck, so for instance, Gaia's Cradle, as we keep bringing up, stuff like that, then by all means put it in. But if you're just a generic, say, green-black mid-range deck, might not be the best thing for you. It could probably just be better as a bigger creature. But if you're after value, if you're looking for the game going long, it's a perfectly good card to play. Ramunap Excavator is a great example of good recursion in the Canadian Highlander format. And along with Ephemerate allowing us to reuse good ETB abilities or protect stuff, 2019 gave us another very good white card that allows us to reuse cards and recur stuff back. It gave us the card Savine's Reclamation, my 4th card. 2 and a white for a sorcery. Return target permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If the spell was cast from a graveyard, you may copy the spell and choose a new target for the copy. Flashback, 4 and a white. This card has been a bit of a sleeper in Canadian Highlander, and it's not a staple yet, but it wouldn't shock me if later in the year we were talking about it in a lot of white decks, because this card is absolutely superb. Savine's Reclamation is another card where the sort of worst thing it will do is still a decent effect. The worst it will often do is return a fetch land from your graveyard to the battlefield, which puts you ahead by a mana. And then later on in the game, you have a flashback for, again, probably at worst, 2 lands. And then that's even more mana. But that's not what you're aiming to do. You're aiming to recur creatures in mid-range decks, recur planeswalkers. In combo, recur cards like Black Lotus and such. You can recur an Underworld Breach in combo decks and stuff like that. It's a very versatile card. Versatility is a word that we've mentioned a lot when talking about these cards, and it's because it's a singleton format. We've mentioned how tutors are good because they're second copies of cards. The charms are good because they give you multiple modes. Cards like Savine's Reclamation gives you, in a sense, multiple copies of a card that you have already played, but also gives you, again, that flexibility with it being any permanent. It's not like it's just a creature or just a planeswalker or just a land. If you need a little bit of mana ramp early in the game, that's very possible. If you're against Burn and there's a Kitchen Finks that they dealt with earlier in a bin, you can return that. Hell, with cards like Eternal Witness, it doesn't even have to be a permanent you can return. If you Savine's Reclamation and Eternal Witness, you can return, say, a Path to Exile to your hand or something like that. It's a card that's a little bit innocuous and a bit sort of, yeah, it's just a decent effect, but it's that classic thing of the upfront cost is still perfectly fine, but then later in the game, you have sitting in your bin a really powerful effect. It's a card that's good early and good late, but its flexibility, its decent mana cost, and the fact it gets more powerful the later you see it in the game just makes it an absolutely fantastic card. Aaron, anything to say about Savine's Reclamation?
Yeah, I will be completely and utterly honest. I slept on this card 100%. I put it in the walk deck, and then all of a sudden I started realizing just how good this card actually is. It was ranging from fixing my mana issues all the way from basically setting up the Time Walk combo to whatever I needed it to be. It never felt like a dead draw at any point because even as a top deck, it was always the best card that was in my graveyard.
Hi guys, Wilko from the future here, or at least in comparison to the rest of this recording. Unfortunately, for a reason that I still can't quite work out, the recording goes a little bit weird from here, and it gets bad enough that the majority of the conversation about Savine's Reclamation has had to be cut. Hopefully at the end you got what Aaron said there, and also at the start of the conversation on the next card, the audio is a little bit dodgy, but it sorts itself out very quickly from here on. I've removed, as I say, unfortunately, the majority of the conversation where it got especially bad. But luckily, it is only Savine's Reclamation where this seemed to happen. But hopefully you got the general gist that it's just a really good card if you're playing a white-based deck with a lot of permanents that you may want to reuse for their either enter the battlefield effects or planeswalkers where you want to reuse, stuff like Teferi's -3. But just generally, like I say, hopefully you sort of got the idea. Hopefully you have in mind certain ways that you can use the card in your decks. And it's definitely a card that I expect to see pop up more and more as time goes on and more powerful permanents that you want to reuse are printed. And yeah, without any further ado, I will let you get back to the majority of the podcast and I'll let Aaron take over with his next card. Thank you, bye.
I'm going to talk about the Royal Scions. It's 1 blue-red for a Will and Rowan Planeswalker that comes in on 5 loyalty. It has 2+1 abilities. The first one is draw a card, then discard a card. The second +1 ability is target creature you control gets +2/+0 first strike and trample until end of turn. And then its ultimate, it's -8. It says draw 4 cards, then deal X to any target, where X is a number of cards in your hand. When I first saw this card, I felt like it was a bit, it's not really anything in particular. It doesn't fill a particular role. It doesn't protect itself very well. And then I got to play with it, and I realized very quickly how I had completely undervalued this card. Like, being able to fix your draw step every single turn is exceptional. Its +1 turns like any of your mega threats into a powerhouse. It ties in really nicely with one of my other favorite cards, a card I nearly talked about today, a card called Dreadhorde Arcanist, where it then bumps its power so you can flash back any other spell. The first strike and trample aspect basically makes kind of your 1/1s into threats where they can't just straight up chump block necessarily, so you can get through token strategies really efficiently. Its ultimate as well is just such a swing in tempo. Drawing 4 cards already off the bat is very strong, but if you've got a decent number of cards in your hand, say, but you've drawn 4 and gone back up to 7, for example, hitting anything for 7 and drawing 4 cards, from there's a good chance you're going to win off the back of that.
2019 was very possibly the worst year in recent memory for Magic design. I think everyone, to some extent, was made a little bit more miserable in 2019 by the cards that they printed. That being said, the Royal Scions might be my all-time favorite 3-mana Planeswalker, and almost certainly in my top 5 Planeswalkers of all time. This card, as soon as I saw it, I thought was so unique and interesting. The fact that none of its abilities really synergize with one another, but at least one of its first 2 abilities is wanted in near enough every deck. The fact that it uses its loyalty as a defense mechanism, which is a thing that has been done, a little bit too much and gone a little bit too far on certain cards. Wilko. But on the Royal Scions, because, as I say, its abilities, it ultimates quite quickly because of it, and it can be a bit of a pest to deal with. But it needs other stuff to make it good. It is not an Oko, where Oko on its own will win the game. Its first ability helps you find better threats or better ways to protect it. Its second ability needs something else in play to be relevant at all. And its final ability, unless you manage to amass like 20 cards in your hand and laser beam people, isn't going to win the game without other help. That being said, when it has help, when it has a creature in play, when you are digging through your deck at a fast rate, this card is incredible and is, as I say, one of my favorite Planeswalkers ever printed, certainly in the 3-mana slot. I have played this in Control. I have played this in mid-range, and playing this in Tempo, a deck that wants to filter through its cards to find threats rather than lands, or find pump spells rather than creatures, or find creatures rather than pump spells, and then wants to play creatures and make them bigger, make them deal more damage quicker. This card is exceptional for Tempo. And I think it is peak Planeswalker design when it comes to that extremely powerful, extremely pesky, quite hard to deal with, but it itself is not really that much of a problem. It is a superb supporting Planeswalker. It's a card where one ability is often better in one deck, one ability is better in the other decks, and then the ultimate, everyone likes drawing 4 cards. Never mind the laser beam that they've attached to it. A lot of people thought that it would be like, oh, in the right deck, this could be okay. No, it turns out that every deck wants at least one of these abilities. And as I say, if you are playing a deck that uses both effectively, it's an absolutely incredible card. And finally, we move to my last card. As much love as I gave Royal Scions just there are cards that I love more. And this may be my all-time favourite card in Magic the Gathering. Anyone who knows me knows that I love value. I'm an Abzan player. I'm a Sultai player. I'm an Esper player. Colour combinations that have a lot of interaction and have a lot of spells and creatures that can just bring you huge amounts of value. And no other card in Magic fills me with as much joy than the card that we named this podcast after in the first place, Seasons Past. Seasons Past is 4 green for a sorcery. Return any number of cards with different converted mana costs from your graveyard to your hand. Put Seasons Past on the bottom of its owner's library. Where to begin with Seasons Past? It's not a card for every deck. A lot of the cards that we've talked about today, we said at the beginning that we weren't really going to talk about staples, but a lot of the cards we've talked about are like staples in certain decks or just really good in the format in general. So maybe not like, Thoughtseize level staples, but like you throw them in a lot of decks. Like Royal Scions goes in a lot of blue-red decks. Caracas goes in most white decks. Seasons Past should go in very, very few decks. But the decks that want it, it's the swing that they often look for in games. My Sultai deck is not the best in the early game. It's Sultai. Sultai, compared to Esper, compared to Grixis, compared to straight blue-white, does not manage the early game nearly as well as those colors. It doesn't have red for Bolt, Chain Lightning, stuff like that. It doesn't have white for Swords and Path. We basically have Push, Abrupt Decay, and Assassin's Trophy, and Assassin's Trophy is not a card you want to be using in the early game. However, what Sultai makes up for is its late game. Sultai's late game is, in my personal opinion and my personal experience, probably the best of any color combination. And one of the reasons that I think that is because it allows you to play Seasons Past. In control decks especially, control decks love to draw cards, and though this isn't strictly drawing, it is a card that allows you to select the best of the cards that you've played in the game. It allows you to pick up a fetch land, you can pick up a Thoughtseize or a Mystical Tutor, you can pick up a counterspell or removal spell, you can pick up a Snapcast, you can pick up a Planeswalker, you can draw 4, 5, 6 cards of your choosing, and when it resolves, it feels like you cannot possibly lose. Never mind its interaction with Mystical Tutor and Time Walk, that is one of the win cons of both my Sultai, personal Sultai control deck, and the deck Curb Your Enthusiasm in Canadian Highlander, which is a blue-green taking turns deck. There is no card in Magic that makes me feel as giddy as Seasons Past does. Several times I felt like there's essentially no hope, but it's always like, I need to somehow draw in one turn a removal spell, a counter spell, a hand attack spell, and then I've top decked Seasons Past and I've just gone on to win from there. The number of games I have won in Sultai at 1, 2, 3 life, all because I hit Seasons Past or played Seasons Past at the right time and accrued enough value, is huge. It is the reason that I play Sultai over other color combinations. It is the reason that Sultai is the deck that I play at every monthly event that I do at my locals when coronavirus isn't occurring. And it is the reason why I stick with this format. There are other formats you can play Seasons Past in, but in this 1v1 20 life environment allowing you to play with some of the most powerful cards in Magic, like Time Walk, there is no card I am happier to see when I have 6 mana in play.
To be completely honest, I both absolutely adore and completely and utterly despise Seasons Past. I absolutely adore the design, I absolutely adore the value, but I absolutely despise how every time you cast it, I am guaranteed to lose. It's just such an incredible engine, and it honestly, if there was ever a Magic card designed for you, I genuinely believe it would be that. It never feels unfair, but it always feels incredibly powerful. And you're right in the sense that like it can't go in every single control deck. Because it's a double green card, it's not one that we're going to splash for. But your Sultai deck utilizes it so wonderfully that I can't possibly imagine that deck without it. It's incredibly impressive. I don't really have much else I can say about Seasons Past, realistically, because I feel, again, you are the person that if there was something to say on it, you definitely know the most about it. But I wholeheartedly agree that it's a card that, if you're wanting to try a different flavor of control in Canadian Highlander, the Seasons Past deck is definitely something I would look into. It's wonderful.
And with that being said, I hope that this episode has given you some cards to think about, or maybe given you some ideas of decks that these cards can go in, or just, maybe we've mentioned a card that you really enjoy and it's nice for you to hear that it's playable in this format. As I've said, I think every episode, Canadian Highlander is the most open, fun, interesting, and just downright best format I have ever played. The cards that we mentioned today range from staples of other formats like Caracas and Legacy or Primetime in Modern, Commander staples like Savine's Reclamation, Pauper staples like Ephemerate. But at the end of the day, I wanted to end on Seasons Past, not because it's just my favourite card in Magic, not just because it's the card we named this podcast after, but because it's an example of a card that a lot of people might overlook because, oh, that's not a Canadian Highlander card. Try stuff out. There are certainly cards, like we mentioned Doubling Season last episode, there are certainly cards that just aren't made for Canadian Highlander. But it doesn't mean that they're not necessarily worth a try, or there might not be a deck that they work in. At the end of the day, if they work for you, if you enjoy playing them, if you enjoy the format, if they make the format a better experience for you, play them. Try them. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Sometimes you will put a Doubling Season into your Naya mid-range deck and you will lose a game because of it. And other times you will try Seasons Past in your Sultai control deck and win game after game after game until you realize that it's not just a core part of your deck, it is the reason you play that deck. Aaron, where can people find you on Twitter?
You can find me on Twitter at TheMightyShaka, where I post terrible memes and usually Magic content. And Wilko, where can they find you on Twitter?
You can find me at Force of Wilko on Twitter. As always, we would like to thank IQ Games for supporting this podcast. Obviously, with the world being the way it is right now, we unfortunately haven't been able to go down to our local game store, but when all of this is over and the world is back to normal, I know the first place that I will be heading, and that is IQ Games. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, whether we know you in person, know you online, or don't know you at all. We will see you in next episode, where we will be talking coherent.